So you have.
Can you see my slides and my text? What can you see?
We see your notes, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. That's what happened last time as well, isn't it? And I don't know why.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why that's happening this time. What if I just go to what do you see now?
Your PowerPoint, so not your presentation.
Just the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yes, but not full screen. So we see your notes. There you go. Yeah, fine.
Now just the slides.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know, that's reading view apparently. So I'll just do that one this time. Okay, let me just stop sharing.
Okay.
I think it'll be good for Mahesh to also try his slides out. Mahesh, what do you think?
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah, just bear with me a second. Just start. I'll just go to share screen.
Yeah, you're fine.
Let me just see whether is that coming through as. Can you see the
slides? Yeah.
And not the notes.
Not the notes. Not the notes. Shall we try one of the videos?
Audios.
Audios.
I think
Yeah.
it would be a great idea. Yeah, I'll just audios. Is that coming through?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, great. I'll stop share.
Right. Shall we start?
Yep.
Are you okay, Krishan? Krishan, to go first? Okay. Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second panel, this panel discussion of the conference, International Conference on the Humanities 2020-2021. As you know, this is held by the Faculty of Humanities in the University of Kelaniya. We are very pleased to have with us 5 eminent researchers today to talk about the history and the legacy of the Portuguese in Sri Lanka. As we all know, as Sri Lankans, this is a long and often contentious part of our colonial past that has left a lasting imprint on Sri Lankan society, religion, languages, and culture in general, and even our very notions of self and notions of our country. The impact is reflected in the interdisciplinary panel we have here today, with presentations drawing from anthropology, religion, archaeology, contact linguistics, and ethnomusicology. So if I may quote from the panel abstract, it draws together ongoing historical and contemporary research, throwing new light on the tangible and intangible impact of the Portuguese legacy. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of the contents of the panel. And before we move on to the individual presentations, I will just remind the panelists that you have up to 15 minutes to speak. And after the four presentations are made, we will go in for the discussion. For the participants, when we start on the discussion, you may raise your hand and then I will invite you to unmute and then speak and then ask your question or make your comment. But you can also use the chat function, right, Asita? I think we can use the chat function to pose questions as well. So you can type any question that you have. I will try my best to take them all in the given time. As you know, we have 2 hours. We go on till 3:30 for this panel. And finally, in the interest of time, I invite everybody to let's keep our questions clear and our comments brief and to the point. Right, now let me introduce our first presenter, who is Krishan Mendes. He's an independent researcher currently on assignment with the Department of Archaeology. He has an MA in Archaeology in Landscape and Heritage from the University of Amsterdam. His MA research focused on a GIS mapping of Dutch and Kandyan fortifications. He has also researched on the built history of Colombo's forts, the subject of his presentation today, on which he has lectured and published extensively. His other research interests include ancient urbanism, military landscapes, and conflict archaeology. He was a researcher and a coordinator for archaeology.lk, where he's published several articles. He's also affiliated to the International Council of Monuments and Sites, or ICOMOS Sri Lanka, where he currently serves as a secretary for the National Scientific Committee on Fortifications and Military Heritage. Welcome to the panel, Krishan. And Krishan is joining from Colombo. I invite you to present now on the fate of the Portuguese forts of Sri Lanka. Over to you, Krishan.
Thank you very much, Dinali, for inviting me for the conference and for that very nice introduction. And first of all, before I move into the presentation, I need to say that it's a pleasure to be in touch once again with Hugo, Dominic, Patricia, and Mahesh. Nice to see you all again. And so my topic today is on the fate of the Portuguese forts in Sri Lanka. So just give me a minute till I share my screen. Y'all can all see the screen, right? Okay, so yeah, the topic which I'm planning on speaking to you all today is the fate of the Portuguese forts in Sri Lanka. And although this may sound like a very typical historical inquiry, it's a bit related to the present as well, mainly in terms of identity issues regarding the present fortification sites. So this is still a working research, and I'm hoping to share the preliminary findings of mine so far. And the reason I came to this issue of the fate of the Portuguese ports is because, as we know, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to come to Sri Lanka and establish European-style military fortifications. And then onwards, we know the Dutch came, the Dutch fought with the Portuguese, took over those sites, and then they themselves established within those territories until the British came and did the same thing. So what in general, the vast amount of colonial period forts in Sri Lanka is generally attributed to the Dutch. And so, but yet here and there again, you hear people referring to, say, a fort like Jaffna or Gaul as being a Portuguese fort. Now, yes, in most of the sites where you find Dutch forts, there were Portuguese forts. But sometimes in the general narrative, it's a bit confusing on how people refer to it and what exactly is the built history from the Portuguese to the Dutch. Or in another sense, what did the Dutch do to the Portuguese forts that they conquered? So I'm planning on investigating this issue mainly through archival and archaeological evidence. And before we go into the conclusions, so I'll just give you all a brief historical context. So the Portuguese come to Sri Lanka in 1506. They first land in Colombo, and to which you can still see the stone on which they carved their coat of arms. So from then onwards, they get involved with the politics of the native kingdoms. And from around the 1590s onwards, they really get a hold of administrative control over the territories, especially of the former Kotte kingdom. And it's from the 1590s onwards that they establish most of their forts. Although like Colombo was established way back in 1518. So the Portuguese established forts right along the coast from around the west, south, east, and the north, as well as certain forts going inland as far as Kandy. So when the Dutch made an alliance with the native kingdom of Kandy in 1638, they immediately besieged the forts of Batiklo and Trincomalee and captured them. And that war continued till 1658, when the Portuguese were finally ousted from Sri Lanka after the fall of Jaffna. And so the general narrative is that once the Dutch captured these areas, these forts, they sort of reused it. Now that word reuse is sort of vague in most descriptions. Like people describe them as they demolished the Portuguese forts, they reused it, they expanded it, and it's not very clear. So the general narrative is that yes, they established forts on those sites and then continued them. So the inquiry starts is that if you look at the Dutch forts or the existing colonial forts from an architectural point of view, they all belong to the Dutch, because at this point when the Dutch came to Sri Lanka, they had distinct fortification architecture to them as opposed to the Portuguese. So it's very easy to distinguish when you just look at the ground plans. Portuguese fort in Sri Lanka during this period and a fort built by the Dutch. So as the Dutch themselves have lots of archival maps, we tend to think that yes, so they built all the existing forts, and that's why rightfully so we call them Dutch forts. But as I said, many of these sites were Portuguese sites, and so then certain historians, certain people tend to refer these as either Portuguese or Dutch. So for example, this is the Gaul fort, and so is it a Portuguese fort or a Dutch fort? So this issue is what I'm going to tackle in the next few slides. So coming to the archival evidence, the first example is of Colombo. So this is a plan from 1630 of the Portuguese city of fortress of Colombo. It includes the present areas of Fort and Peta. So then the Dutch capture Colombo in 1656, and they initially used the Portuguese fort, but they later remodeled this into what you see on the right. Second, right. So the first archival evidence of this, what I'm trying to show here is that from a fortress maintenance report dated to July 10th, 1681 from the National Archives in The Hague, that speaks of several, so that's well after about 20 years after the Dutch established themselves in Colombo. So this plan you all see here is dated to 1681 and related to that maintenance report. And so in black, I have highlighted here the outline of the Portuguese fort. So these locations, which I have shown here in the blue arrows, that they actually contained sections of the old Portuguese walls. And this is another report map, survey map dated to 1687. And this particular cross section over here is specifically identified as being Portuguese. So as you can see, there is a different colored section of the wall that is identified as a Portuguese wall, and that would be over here. So this is archival evidence from Colombo to say that, to show that they reused the Portuguese walls wherever their new outline of Colombo fort matched. The second archival evidence is from Kalutara, where this feature over here, it is actually on a hill, whereas this part of the ramparts and bastions are at the base of the hill. So the Portuguese are the first to establish fort in Kalutara early in the 1600s, and then it changes hand during their wars with the Dutch in the 1640s. But by around 1640, by 1655, the Dutch completely captured the fort of Kalutara, and they continue using it for some time till about the 1670s. And this map dated to the 1690s actually gives annotations that referring to this particular section as being part of the old Portuguese wall. So we can see that all the way into the 1690s itself, they sort of incorporated the existing Portuguese fort into their new designs, whereas they built around the old Portuguese fort. Next, we come to the interesting archaeological evidence that came up a few years ago in 2017 when the University of Durham excavated Jaffna. And So what you see here is the drawing of the Portuguese fort of Jaffna. As you can see, it's quadrangular in shape. It has 2 round bastions, 2 triangular bastions, and uh, 3 half circular bastions. And this is the Dutch fort in its same position what they built after removing this fort. And it's, as you can notice, it's quite different, but not exactly as we would see. So from the 2017 investigations, they identified these 2 features, these 2 circular features actually can be seen in the Dutch ramparts, and that actually is due to the civil war that happened in Sri Lanka 10 years ago, where the Jaffna fort was heavily damaged. And as you can see here, this circular part actually is found within the ramparts. This section is actually broken off. And so this is the walkway, and then you get this circular feature, and then definitely it would have been once enclosed by the Dutch rampart. So this picture I actually took in 2017, just before those excavations. And even I realized, having studied European fortress design, even I was a bit confused as to what is this sort of semicircular feature within sort of the rampart. And it's from that study only that I really realized that when you compare the old Portuguese map, you can actually see it is actually that feature. So this is viewing that part of the rampart from the covered way. It's not too evident, but as you can see, it is, since this section has been exposed due to damage, you can actually see this part within the ramparts. And coming to Gaul, another archaeological evidence from Gaul. So Gaul, actually, you can take it as archival evidence as well. So this map is of the Portuguese fort of Gaul, which the Dutch captured in 1640, but which they maintained for about 20 years. So this drawing is a Dutch drawing, but it represents the Portuguese walls. So Portuguese Gaul basically was a simple peninsula and a gun battery on this area. So this is the Dutch plan of Gaul, as many of you all would recognize. And so that also you all can see it has a straight line of rampart cutting the peninsula from the mainland, and 3 bastions more or less within those same areas. Give me a second. And so later on, what the Dutch did was they built the rest of the rampart encircling the whole peninsula. But the interesting more archaeological evidence from Gaul is actually this particular feature. This is the Moon Bastion when you're standing within it. And so this is the entrance to Moon Bastion from within. And if many of you all would have noticed this particular feature right next to it. So this is actually known as a casemate, where it was a gun port fitted within the rampart, and the cannon would be inside here firing outside. So now the casemate is a particular feature that was not there in the Dutch forts in Sri Lanka. So, but there are references to casemates in the Portuguese forts of Sri Lanka. And so apart from that, one would also wonder why there is a gun port fitted within the bastion of the Dutch, like who they want to shoot, their own men? No. So this, even now, it has been restored from inside during the recent reconstructions, and it has been positively identified as being Portuguese. And that, so it's evident that the Dutch simply used the main Portuguese rampart and they built over the Portuguese bastions in their new design. And so with those modifications, this casemate, which would have once faced the open area in front of the ramparts, got enclosed within the Moon Bastion. This is now what they have restored from within. You can actually go inside here and see. And another feature to evidence to show that the Dutch encircle the Portuguese bastions of Gaul with their own designs is this feature again on Moon Bastion. This is the second tier, and you all would see a feature like this. But recently they opened it up, and you all can see that there is a completely different internal structure which has been sealed. And these 2 has been dated as a Portuguese construction. And I'm also partly involved in some excavations as part of this restoration project of Gaul. And so most of the early layers of the rampart has been relatively dated to the Portuguese period. So it's very evident from Gaul that what you find right now is sort of a Portuguese skeleton which the Dutch used to basically encircle it. So those are some of my tentative evidence which I have. And so as to conclude as to what exactly happened to the Portuguese forts, one, you could say that they were almost completely demolished, yet incorporated sections of the Portuguese walls wherever the Dutch plan overlapped, such as at Colombo and Jaffna, as you all saw. Then it also can be a redevelopment of the Portuguese walls and on structure, usually using it as a core for the new Dutch walls. Those examples can be said of Gaul, Kalutara, and even Anguruatara, which I couldn't uh, add a map of it here. But when you analyze the map of Anguruatara, also you can identify the old style Portuguese bastions and then a Dutch style bastion enclosing it. Then there is also a complete demolition of the Portuguese fort and rebuilding of a completely new Dutch fort, such as Trincomalee and Beticlo, where the Trincomalee and Beticlo Portuguese forts were captured by the Dutch and they were demolished by the Candians in 1643. And then about 20 years later, the Dutch come and rebuild their forts on those same sites. So it's hard to imagine whether there could have been any trace of the Portuguese forts when the Dutch came there once again. So in those instances, you can say it's a complete demolition. And fourth is the reuse of Portuguese forts by partial reconstruction. That is, after the Portuguese had abandoned them, and the Dutch come and capture that area and reuse it. An example is Ratnapura, because there is a plan of the Portuguese fort of Ratnapura, which is square and has two diagonally opposite bastions. And there is no plan of the Dutch fort of Ratnapura, but you get historical descriptions of eyewitness accounts of the Ratnapura Dutch fort being a square fort with two bastions. So it's most probably that when they came there, the Portuguese had abandoned only about 15 years ago. And so the fort would have still been around and they would have just uh, cleared it and reused it. So uh, as we can see, those are some of the, so it's not very straightforward as to what happened to the Portuguese forts, but a variety of ways. And from this, we can understand that the Dutch, when dealing with the old Portuguese forts, they used a very pragmatic approach instead of completely demolishing it, where they use whatever the remaining resources they have and yet finally implement their own design of the fortress as well. So that's why you see either it's incorporating sections wherever their plans overlapped, or completely remodeling or completely encircling the Portuguese walls, and in such various ways. So this brings us just to the concepts of ownership and identity. And so whose fort is it, such as even in the case of Gaul, because you could argue it's not Portuguese, but then you can also argue, okay, it's not wholly Dutch as well. Uh, and in this sense, I believe when it comes to identifying a fort, at least in Sri Lanka, as a Portuguese or Dutch fort, it should be spoken of in context of the discussion, because one could even say that if the discussion is about the British military establishment in Sri Lanka, and if they want to draw out a map and show where the British had their military bases, they would have, they will have to use they will have to represent even the Gaul and Jaffna forts as British forts, because as we know, once the British took over, they too garrisoned the Dutch forts. They did not do much modifications, but they generally used most of the Dutch forts. So in that context, you can even identify Gaul and Jaffna as a British fort. So uh, this issue is not very straightforward, but I believe it in terms of identity and ownership of a fort. When you're trying to express it like that, it should be spoken of in context of the discussion. So I hope that was clear. I hope my internet connection wasn't too much of an issue. And with that, I would like to uh, end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishan. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Very engaging presentation on the archaeology and the identities of the forts. And thank you very much for sharing your ongoing research with us. And I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions posed to you at discussion time. So our next presenter is Dr. Dominic Essler, who's an independent researcher. He completed his PhD in social anthropology at the University College London in 2020. Between 2013 and 2015, he conducted fieldwork in Mana district, during which time he was also a visiting student at the Department of Sociology at the University of Colombo. The main focuses of his research are caste and religion, which he approaches from both anthropological and historical perspectives. And he's also particularly interested in food and language. During the past 2 semesters, he has been a tutor in anthropology at St. Andrews University. Dr. Essler's presentation is titled The Catholic Church in Portuguese Sri Lanka, Exploring the 1646 Inquiry in Jaffna. And Dominic is joining us from St. Andrews in Scotland. Welcome, Dominic, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, you should be able to see that now. Is that okay? Okay. Great, okay, thank you. Right. On the 17th of July, 1645, Dom Felipe Mascarenhas, who was both the 9th and the 15th governor of Portuguese Ceylon, and who had arrived in Jaffna after having been shipwrecked at Calpitia on his way to Goa, where he was due to take up his position as Viceroy of the Portuguese state of India, issued an order to the Captain Major of the Kingdom of Jaffna at that time, Francisco de Seixas de Cabrera. This order was to investigate, and here I quote, the many and diverse complaints that the native inhabitants of this kingdom have made with regard both to acts of force and violence that they have suffered, and to new customs which have been introduced on account of which they have many times been dispossessed of their properties and compelled to go over to the lands of our enemies, to the great discredit of God and of his majesty. Mascarenhas instructed de Cabrera to summon the native inhabitants and any other persons of his choice, and to gather information by asking 6 questions about who was oppressing and harassing the people and what this involved. Specifically the deprivation of lands, property, or agricultural products for which the people paid rent to the Portuguese state, as well as forced unpaid service, imprisonment, punishment, and fines. Starting the next day in the Portuguese fort of Our Lady of Miracles in Jaffna, and continuing on several further separate days up to the 30th of August of that year, 1645, de Cabrera interviewed 40 local men whose complaints focused largely on the activities of Portuguese missionaries. It is these activities and the broader relationship between the missionaries, the Portuguese state of India, and the local people that I will discuss in this paper, which presents my preliminary research on the topic. Let me start with some methodological comments. Okay. The 40 complaints, which were written down by de Cabrera's clerk, are found in Portugal's national archives in the Monsoon books, or Livros dos Monsóis, records of the correspondence between Portugal and the Viceroy in India. That these are the original documents, which were moved from Goa to Lisbon in 1777, is shown by the Tamil and Portuguese signatures of the witnesses, such as those that you can see on this slide, along with that of the Tamil interpreter, Tomé de Moraes. At some point, possibly in the 1980s, the Catholic priest, Father Vito Perniola, obtained a microfilm copy of the complaints. Now, Perniola was an Italian priest born in 1913 who came to Sri Lanka in 1936 and died aged 102 in 2016. He was a scholar and a polyglot who spent a number of years compiling and translating Catholic documents to produce a 19-volume series called The Catholic Church in Sri Lanka, which contains 3 volumes on the Portuguese period, 3 on the Dutch, and 13 on the British, ending coincidentally in 1913, the year of Perniola's birth. These volumes are an invaluable starting place for anyone working on Catholicism in Sri Lanka and for Sri Lankan history more broadly. It turns out, however, that Perniola himself was unable to read his microfilm when it was developed. And it was actually the Goan historian Teotonio de Souza who eventually transcribed and translated most of it for him. So I imagine that if these transcriptions and translations still exist, they must be among Perniola's remaining possessions. Like Perniola, although despite having access to high quality digital images through the Portuguese National Archives, I have also found it difficult to decipher the handwriting of some of these complaints. So this is to stress both that this is ongoing research and that the translation that I've used here comes from Perniola's volumes. Although, as he was not entirely clear about his methods, individual letters may have been transcribed by de Souza, Perniola himself, or an unnamed third scholar. What I've been doing so far is running some preliminary checks of the translations against the original documents. Now let me return to the Portuguese period. While Catholicism was brought to southern Sri Lanka by the missionaries, predominantly or entirely Franciscans, who accompanied the Portuguese intervention in the Kingdom of Kotte from the early 1500s. In the north, Catholicism in fact preceded the original arrival of the Portuguese state via the activities of Jesuits engaged in mass conversions on the coast of southern India. This began in 1544 when St. Francis Xavier, then in India, received a message from the inhabitants of Mannar Island asking him to send someone to baptize them. Now, if I return to my initial image, this seems to be based, this image seems to be based on St. Francis Xavier's first biography by Father João de Lucena in 1600, although it's not a story I've come across in the earlier Portuguese letters. Soon after the baptisms in Mannar, the king of Jaffna, within whose territory Mannar fell, sent soldiers to execute several hundred converts, who became known as the Mannar martyrs and are central to local Catholicism in Mannar diocese today. Although Sir Francis Xavier called for swift retribution, it took the Portuguese until 1560 to build a fort on Mannar Island and until 1591 to establish themselves in Jaffna, where they continued to face opposition until its formal annexation in 1619. Jaffna was both strategically and economically significant for the Portuguese. As in other parts of Ceylon, land-based revenues were extremely important, and the initial Portuguese tombos, the registers of land ownership, family and caste that were continued by the Dutch, were tested first in northern Ceylon. Two other things are important to note here. The first is the fact that under the Portuguese, entire villages could be granted to secular or religious individuals who had the right to a portion of that village's produce and labour. The second is the fact that in Jaffna, the Portuguese state enforced a compulsory, usually caste-based form of labour called ulian, which was similar to what was known as Rajakarya in the south. Now, Jaffna was a particular focus of missionary conversion efforts, and by the mid-17th century, the Portuguese claimed that almost all of its population had become Catholic. That religious conquest was a central element of Portuguese expansion is well known, although historians such as Alan Stravern and Zoltan Biederman have stressed the complexities of the context and the need to reconsider local agency. It has also been suggested that this was only a nominal conversion, as most reverted to Hinduism after the Portuguese were expelled by the Dutch. By the time of the 1645 inquiry, there were three religious orders in Jaffna: Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans, and around 40 missionaries in total, more than half of whom were Franciscans. There are around the same number of churches across the Jaffna Peninsula, and as one of the inquiry witnesses noted, unlike state officers, the priests were always with the people. At least partly due to lack of Tamil competence, which affected missionary activities throughout the Portuguese period, the priests worked through two types of local agents. The first were the meirinhos, a term meaning something like bailiffs or magistrates, who are officers entrusted with the duty of apprehending criminals and other malefactors, either with regard to state activities or to those of the church. For example, the meirinhos made sure all were present for Sunday worship. Both state and church roles appear to have continued under the Dutch, and the term meirinho survives today in the altered form melange, which is used in some northern parishes to refer to the person responsible for safeguarding the church and ringing the bell, although it has developed a secondary etymology as a derivation of bell in charge. The second type of local agents were the Kanakapillais, people who kept accounts or records, a Tamil term that exists today in more widespread use, sometimes abbreviated as KP. It's worth noting that of the 40 witnesses called to the inquiry at the Jaffna fort, none were priests themselves or their agents. The majority were Tamil men aged between 27 and 84, who came from villages across the 4 patus or provinces of Jaffna, Valigamam, Vardamarachi, Tembarachi, and Pachilapalli, the last of which is not considered a historical province today. These were secular officials of different levels, village headmen and elders, or taliyars and mayorals, local judges called otiars, and senior state adigar officials. However, 8 of the witnesses were Portuguese tax and rent collectors between the ages of 40 and 65, some or all of whom had been granted villages in the manner I previously mentioned. While some of the Tamil witnesses did mention complaints about officials, for example, a headman from the village of Alvai in Vardamarachi states that the adigars of that patu were claiming excessive amounts of rice and money, the majority of the complaints refer to the missionaries and their agents. So let me now turn to the complaints themselves. Although there isn't enough time for me to analyse individual complaints here, a number of repeated issues appear throughout them. That the people had to provide fruit, paddy, trees, animals, fish, toddy, and other products, as well as land, regardless of the quantity of the harvest and other compulsory state taxes. That they were also asked to provide a variety of labour, primarily agricultural, such as tending gardens and carrying logs. That married and unmarried men were summoned to keep watch over priests' lands at night, although there was no war to be concerned about, and some saw this as a ploy to use their labour the next morning. That men were forced to hunt with the priest. That children were called to catechetics classes, that is, religious education, which were actually an excuse to put them to work. Now, as is evident, a central element of the complaints was the extraction of various types of labour and resources by the missionaries. Such demands meant that families were deprived of the labour necessary to tend to their own land and agriculture, and were unable to attend their ulium labour owed to the state. According to the witnesses, the priests also extracted money from the people through punitive funeral costs, including compulsory burial payments for bodies left elsewhere, as well as fines for arriving late at Mass and for men living with women to whom they were not married. I want to note that this apparent lack of commitment to Orthodox Catholic marriage practices appears briefly in other contexts, for example, with regard to priests' opposition to cross-cousin marriage. Such demands were often said to have been enforced by tyrannical Meirinhos and Kanakapillais, who, the witnesses noticed, would enter people's homes directly, although the priests themselves also played a role. Some priests, it was said, kept their debtors in wooden prisons or had them tied to pillars and beaten. Priests themselves were accused of violence, with a number of witnesses mentioning torn ears resulting from their blows, and priests were also accused of molesting village women and of committing murders. Some witnesses foregrounded their inability to contribute to the state, noting that local people had fled to the Vanni, Kandy, and India, and emphasising that the current rules were quite different to those of the pre-Portuguese period. It was also said that they had had nobody to complain to before this opportunity. So there has been some debate about the extent to which these complaints accurately reflect the actions of the missionaries during this period. Fernão de Queiroz, whose 17th century tome, The Temporal and Spiritual Conquest of Ceylon, is one of the most significant histories of the Portuguese period, argued that similar complaints elsewhere were concocted by state officials to deflect attention from their own similar misdeeds. And much more recently, Perniola was suspicious that the Jaffna complaints referred rarely to state officials, writing that they seemed orchestrated. In contrast, Gaston Pereira's self-identified nationalist perspective in his 2009 study of the Portuguese Church accepts the complaints as true. Teotonio de Souza complicates both positions by noting that there were some complaints about state officials, and also that this was not the first time people had made such complaints about missionaries in Ceylon or elsewhere. De Souza also suggests that the behaviour of the missionaries may have been connected to the fact that many had come to Ceylon as punishment for misbehaviour elsewhere, particularly in India, and that many were also former soldiers who had joined the church due to a lack of other means of support. Now, on the other hand, further questions are invited by the fact that the Tamil witnesses were mainly state officials themselves, that so many of the complaints were identical, and that many shared second-hand information. Other details emerge from a close reading. For example, the criticisms of Portuguese collectors and Tamil Adigars appear only on the first day of the inquiry and reveal existing grievances that seem to have been expressed previously in written form. In contrast, the third witness on the same day, the Adiga Dom Gaspar Fonseca of Putur, states that state officials had never caused any injustice in his village. It appears that similarly minded Taliar village headmen attended on the same day with knowledge of each other's intentions, and that Dom Gaspar Fonseca's statement was a direct rejection of their claims. Perhaps it also means that the witnesses gave their testimonies as a group rather than privately. Another relationship was revealed on a different day when Dom Baltazar Chandana, Otiar judge and Taliar headman of Vatakote, claimed that the villagers had never been oppressed since the village had been given as a grant to Antonio Lobo de Quental, a former Portuguese collector who himself gave testimony towards the end of the inquiry period when almost all of the Portuguese witnesses were called. Regardless of the accuracy of the complaints, they reveal a network of complex relationships involving both support and conflict in Jaffna between local people, missionaries, and secular Portuguese men connected to the state. What is not so evident from the complaints, but is noted explicitly in other contemporary sources, is that there was an ongoing controversy concerning control over villages, with their Portuguese owners accusing the missionaries of subverting their authority and sources of labor. However, in addition to this debate, what I'm interested in, we'll be looking at in the future, are a cluster of less prominent issues that emerged in the inquiry. The first of these is caste, which is mentioned throughout, particularly with regard to various taxes and work duties and how these have changed since the arrival of the Portuguese. In connection to caste are questions of slavery, as the complaints, as in other correspondence from this period, often refer to slaves or escravos among the local population. Without making further conjectures about the meaning of the term escravo at this time, I want to suggest that the Portuguese sources offer significant resources that so far seem to have been broadly overlooked amid the recent historical interest in slavery in Jaffna that has focused largely on the Dutch period. But to return to the inquiry, what was its outcome? In January 1646, Mascarenhas, by then stationed as Viceroy of the Portuguese state of India in Goa, suggested to King João IV of Portugal that the churches in Jaffna should be entrusted to native priests. However, in March 1648, the king rejected this suggestion and said that orders already given would be enough to remedy the situation. In 1658, the Dutch took Jaffna, imprisoning and expelling the missionaries and initiating a period of hostility against Catholics. Under the Dutch, the activities of Catholic missionaries, who were Oratorians from Goa who entered Sri Lanka surreptitiously, was significantly different, although this is beyond the bounds of this paper. However, I want to finish by noting that the Oratorians were part of the Padroada Real, or royal patronage, that is, the territories and churches controlled by the Portuguese monarchy from the 16th century onwards. The Oratorians were active in Sri Lanka until the second half of the 19th century, when they overlapped with a new wave of European missionaries. Now, in the Jaffna Bishop's House archive, as you can see on this slide, there are Oratorian marriage registers from the middle of the 19th century, which was still being written in Tamil and Portuguese, while the rest of the records are predominantly in French. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for that wonderful presentation, that incisive reading of the 40 reports of the 17th century inquiry. I think we'll move in for some very interesting questions, and maybe you can talk more about your current reading of it, how it relates to the future as well. So thank you very much. So moving now, we go to a joint presentation by Hugo Cardoso and Patricia Costa, both from the University of Lisbon. Hugo is no stranger to Sri Lanka. He has visited us many times, and our faculty as well. He holds a degree from the Universities of Coimbra and Amsterdam, is currently an assistant professor at the University of Lisbon. His research focuses on language contact, and he has documented extensively the endangered Portuguese-based Creoles of South Asia, particularly Sri Lanka Portuguese and the Portuguese Creole spoken in Diu and in the Malabar coast of India. He has also worked on a Creole of Suriname, the name of which I will not try to pronounce. His work combines a synchronic descriptive perspective with an interest in the history of these languages and in comparative approaches. Joining him as co-presenter is Patricia Costa, also of the University of Lisbon, where she's currently a PhD student in linguistics. Her research, conducted under the supervision of Hugo, focuses on language variation and change in Creole speech communities characterized by language contact, obsolescence, and endangerment. She primarily draws on empirical insights from Sri Lanka Portuguese, the Portuguese-based Creole spoken in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. Patricia joins us from Lisbon in Portugal, and Hugo, lucky Hugo, is speaking to us from Pico Island in the Azores, from the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Over to you, Hugo and Patricia.
Thank you so much, Dinali. And thank you everyone for attending, and the organizers of ICH for inviting us to talk to you. As Dinali mentioned, I'm in an island, actually in the middle of the Atlantic. These may not be the ideal conditions for a Zoom meeting, but I hope you can see me and hear me properly. Right, so it's a pleasure to be with you. And what we are going to do today, Patricia and I, is talk to you a little bit about a recent initiative to document or further document Sri Lanka Portuguese, and also some of the descriptive work that ensued from it. And what we want to share with you is the resources that we've created, which are available for everyone, and also some of the new insights that come from it. So moving on to the next slide, Dinali has already mentioned that what we call Sri Lanka Portuguese right now, and earlier was called, of course, Ceylon Portuguese, is considered a Creole language. That means that it's a high contact language that results from contact between a number of different languages. It was earlier spoken basically all over the island of Sri Lanka, but currently it is mostly spoken on the eastern province, and especially around the cities of Trincomalee, Batikalo, and Kalmunai in the Ampara district, but also in Jaffna, and we'll get to Jaffna in a moment. It is spoken as a first language or as the second language by the so-called Portuguese burghers, who are a minority Eurasian community of Sri Lanka, who claim a Portuguese ancestry, and that's part of their identity, including their linguistic identity. It is currently an endangered language, and we'll give you some relatively recent data to back this up. And our estimate is that in the Eastern Province, it is spoken with some degree of fluency by around 1,300 speakers. It could be a little bit more, but we'll get to that. Now, moving on to the next slide, please. Right. So by way of background, and we'll start with a little very brief historical background of how this language developed. It is important to notice that Sri Lanka Portuguese, as a Portuguese-based Creole of Asia, is actually one in a string of related languages that were once spoken all the way from India to possibly Japan and East Timor, close to Australia. So there is something to be said of the historical trajectory that created all of these languages, and some connections that you can actually see and perceive between them. From that perspective, an important issue to notice is that the Portuguese, let's say, colonial involvement with Asia started in 1498, as you probably know, with the arrival of Vasco da Gama in southwestern India. And it did start in southwestern India. So what's currently the state of Kerala, earlier known as the Malabar or Travancore coasts, that's where it all started. And it was from there that the exploration of the different regions of Asia proceeded, including Ceylon. Next slide, please. And what we know is that along this history, or throughout this history of expansion, which started as you saw in the early 16th century and proceeded very rapidly until the end of the 16th century. What we know from all sorts of records, including the one that we have here, is that it was accompanied by the development of something that became a bit of a lingua franca in Asia, which was described, let's say, in the 18th century by this British captain, Hamilton, as being, as you can see, very corrupted, right? So a vestige of their language, though much corrupted, yet it is the language that most Europeans learned first to qualify them for a general converse with one another, as well as with the inhabitants of India. So what we know is that Portuguese did carve this role of lingua franca among certain populational groups in Asia, but what did circulate was not Portuguese as spoken natively by, for example, people from Portugal. It was something that already showed the signs of intense contact. And this is at the root of the creation of the Creole languages, including Ceylon Portuguese or Sri Lanka Portuguese. Next, please. Patricia is the one managing the slide. That's why I have to ask for the next slide. All right, so in the case of Sri Lanka, the period of, as you probably know, the period of the colonial Portuguese period is between 1505 and 1658, roughly, which means that this is the period of around 150 years in which we are looking at the establishment of the Portuguese language on the island and the creation of this language that now we call Sri Lanka Portuguese, but its history actually extends way beyond 1658, in fact, going on all the way to the present, and that's why we are interested in it right now. So the creation of this language and the establishment of this language on Sri Lanka is one of the visible impacts of this colonial period. But there are other impacts that you can still see, and with this, I will hand over to my colleague Patricia.
So I hope you can hear me. So the presence of the Portuguese in Ceylon lasted for about 1.5 centuries and left a long-lasting imprint on the cultural, social, and linguistic landscape of the island. So besides the introduction of Roman Catholicism and other cultural practices related to music, dance, and culinary, their presence resulted also in long onomastic contributions and also lexical exchanges, with many Portuguese words being absorbed into and Sinhalese languages. The colonial involvement of the Portuguese in Ceylon also motivated the emergence of new and well-defined communities, known today as Portuguese burghers and Kafirs. Out of intense contact between Portuguese and the native languages, it has emerged a new language, which has become the lingua franca of Sri Lanka up to the 19th century, spoken not only by the Eurasian communities as a native language, but also by the Tamil and the Sinhalese people as a second language. According to a Goan priest and philologist called Sebastião Delgado, this language is spoken as a mother tongue by almost all Eurasians or burghers, and learned out of commercial, domestic, or religious convenience by many Europeans and natives. He has a considerable literature and keeps producing books, booklets, and periodicals, which can be clearly seen to have numerous readers. It is a cultivated and defined dialect of exuberant vitality. Despite this exuberant vitality of the previous centuries, and as we will see later, the vitality of this language is now rapidly decreasing, and its use is now restricted to the Portuguese burghers from the eastern and northern provinces of Sri Lanka. But story apart, what is this language made of? Let's look at a quick example for the sentence, "You'll come back here another day," which in modern Sri Lanka Portuguese would be something like, "In dia botus aquilo vi." At a first glance, we can see that it greatly differs from the early and modern European Portuguese. But if we inspect more carefully, we see that the words Sri Lanka Portuguese uses in this example derive all from European Portuguese. The order in which these words are organized, however, are quite similar to the Tamil order. So, although benefited from contributions from Portuguese, Tamil, and to some extent Sinhala, Sri Lanka Portuguese emerged as a unique language with a grammar and a vocabulary of its own. And that was exactly what caught the attention of observers, especially missionaries, since at least the 19th century. They realized that in order to communicate with the people, they would have to use a language that everyone could understand in the island. And that language was Sri Lanka Portuguese. So they have published several books in or about language, grammars, phrase books, dictionaries, and religious books as well. After this period, there was a gap of several decades without any significant production on Sri Lanka Portuguese. In the 70s, however, several scholars took a fresh interest in the language and engaged in fieldwork-based documentation, including Ian Smith or Shihan de Silva, just to mention a few. In the early 80s, fieldwork research was abruptly interrupted by the start of the Sri Lankan Civil War. But in 2015, a new project was about to begin, and that's what Ugo is telling us, will tell us now.
All right, so following the tradition and adding to this tradition of linguistic documentation, scientific fieldwork-based linguistic documentation, which began in the 70s and went on to the modern days. In 2015, I decided to start my own project with specifically the intention of creating a publicly available documentation and archive of Sri Lanka Portuguese as spoken by as many people as possible. And so this began in 2015 and went on until the present day. And this is the project that we want to talk to you about. It is a fieldwork-based linguistic and ethnomusicological documentation. So we focus not only on language, but also on music, which is going to be the topic of our next talk. And here we'll talk about the linguistic documentation aspect of the project. It was a relatively multifaceted project because we added a number of components to it. One of them, which was necessary for the linguistic documentation, was orthography development. So we held a workshop with a number of native speakers in Batik law to define a suitable orthography for a language which did not have a set orthographic a set of orthographic rules up until then. And this was necessary because our corpus and our collections are fully transcribed. So we needed to define the orthography. And it was also accompanied by a sociolinguistic survey, which had the intention of assessing the degree of vitality and the actual use of the language among the Portuguese burghers in the Eastern Province at present. This was called Documentation of Sri Lanka Portuguese, DSLP. And this was a project that started officially in 2017 and officially already ended, but it is a gift that keeps on giving because we are still working on the data and we continue to research it. The intention, as I told you, was to create a digital and open access corpus of modern Sri Lanka Portuguese. It is now available on the Endangered Languages Archive online, so you can access it. This project was funded by the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, which was run up until recently from SOAS in London and just moved to Germany. I was the principal investigator, but we worked with a team. Patricia was a member. Mahesh Radhakrishnan, who is going to speak next, was also a member. And we had a few more that joined us in the team. The host institution was University of Lisbon Center for Linguistics, where we work. And we collected data, audiovisual data, mostly between 2015 and 2020. The project focused on the Eastern Province because this is where the largest concentration of Portuguese burghers and speakers of this language was, especially the districts of Trincomalee, Batiklo, and Ampara. And in the case of Ampara, mostly the city of Kalmunai. But in the meantime, it was also possible to contact speakers in Jaffna, the very last speakers. It's a very small community that's left in Jaffna. And this was added later on by Mahesh Radhakrishnan and Patricia Costa. Next, please. So the result is a collection of more than 50 hours of recorded speech featuring over 150 speakers. And you can see some photos there that show that we try to have a decent representation of the community. So we have different age groups all the way from children to some elderly speakers. And we try to diversify the genres of our collection. So we have interviews, we have demonstrations of, for example, cooking, as you can see in one of those photos, or of crafts. All the data are transcribed, annotated, and translated into English before they go into the archive. And here's an example for those of you who may never have heard Sri Lanka Portuguese, but also for some of you who are from the community, and I know some of you are attending. Here's an example taken from one of the interviews with Mrs. Philomena Jonathan and Mrs. Juliana Kelly, just north of Trincomalee.
Akalai noiva pai noiva puchamatandina noiva Carlo manda noiva sagasa asi alanda tona studio panda vintra agaristi video na uttamana studio tanda photo tutira kaselodi ravana roikini.
All right, so this is just a very short clip, and you can see on the right the what the orthography that we'll have developed looks like, and this is what you will find in our records in the archive if you consult them. Next, please. Right, in addition to this linguistic collection that I've just shown, we've also along the way collected and transcribed as many of the written sources of the 19th and early 20th centuries as we could. And some of them are already also available on the Endangered Languages Archive collection. Others will be added soon. And as I mentioned earlier, there was also an assessment of the vitality of the language through a sociolinguistic survey, which was applied to as large as possible a proportion of the Portuguese Burgher community of the Eastern Province. In this particular case, the questionnaire was developed and conducted by our colleague Rui Pereira. The results are still being processed, but what we can show you here are the basic preliminary results, which are relevant for an assessment of linguistic vitality among the community. And out of 3,094 respondents to the questionnaire in all of the areas that we showed you earlier, what we found is that, so these are respondents from the Portuguese Burgher community of those areas. Only 26% of the respondents claim to be fluent in Sri Lanka Portuguese, and 16% claim to be partially fluent, which means that over half of the population of the community is not fluent at all. And if on the right you look at that graph, it shows you the distribution of fluency by age groups in the three districts. So Batiklo in orange, Ampara in yellow, and Trincomalee in green. And what you can see at a first glance is that, as you would expect, there is a higher proportion of fluency in among elderly people, and much less so among the younger generations, which is obviously a sign of endangerment. But the situation in all the three districts is not the same. So you can see that consistently the numbers are lower in Ampara than in the other districts. And you will see that Trincomalee actually has a higher proportion of speakers among the younger generations than the other districts. Next, please. Right, so after having completed and compiled this corpus, which, as I mentioned earlier, we transcribed, annotated, and publicly made available on the archive, the next step is to look at the data and see what we can learn from it about how the language works. And this is description and analysis. And obviously the language had already been described before. We've mentioned names such as Ian Smith and Shihanda Silva Jayasuriya here. What we have done with our corpus was to add a little bit more complexity to it, and specifically to engage with the variability within and across speech communities in this language. This is a very short example of how our documentation and ensuing description have added to the prior knowledge. And we're going to try and show it to you by looking at the personal pronouns of this language. As I mentioned, they had already been described, and Ian Smith, based on his work in the 1970s, had already come up with this paradigm that you see here. And it gives you different forms for first, second, third singular and plural pronouns, and 3 sets for nominative, oblique, and genitive. And what you find here is that you have dedicated forms for the nominative personal pronouns, and then tendentially what you have in the oblique and genitive is the addition of a suffix, which is either pa for the oblique or su for the genitive to the nominative form, right? And that is consistent, and it is only the first person singular which behaves a little differently. Oh, can you go back, please, Patricia? Right. So in addition to this, what we also find is that there is a distinction between honorificity. So there are honorific and non-honorific personal pronouns, as in other languages in Sri Lanka that were developed for the second and the third personal pronouns. And there's also a gender distinction between masculine and feminine only in the third person. All right, now moving on to the next one. So this is Smith's paradigm, which is based on his corpus collected mostly in Batik law. And since our corpus is larger and has been collected in more areas and with a wider set of speakers, evidently, as you would expect, we find alternative forms, which is what we represent here. So the forms in purple here are the ones that had not been documented before, but which are present in our corpus. So you can see that there's a considerable addition of forms to the paradigm. And what we find here are different situations. So in some cases, the forms that we find are simply slightly different from what had already been described. So for example, e versus eu, or botrus versus botus, right? In other cases, what you find is something a little more significant, I would say. And it is the intrusion of that analytical strategy of the nominative personal pronoun plus an oblique or genitive suffix into the first person, right? So there's a generalization of that rule into the first person, and that's why you find things like pa, mi, pa, eu, se, minha, se, etc. All right, next. In addition to all of this variation that we found, which is interesting in itself, there was something particular about the inclusion here of the Jaffna variety. And the Jaffna variety is kind of is relatively new. It was also a surprise for us that that there were speakers in Jaffna. But since we could locate them and interview them, it turns out that this particular community in Jaffna, not only for being very small, but for being relatively isolated from the communities in the Eastern Province, their speech actually has a number of interesting innovations, let's say, and differences with regard to what we already knew of Sri Lanka Portuguese. And what we find, for example, in the first hand is a reduced system of honorificity. So the distinctions between honorific and non-honorific, that's to say polite and familiar forms of address that that operate in Sri Lanka Portuguese in general, have been reduced in the Jaffna variety. So there's a certain loss of a stylistic loss here, which we attribute to an advanced stage of language obsolescence or language loss. And there are certain forms, such as, for example, redundant double-marked forms. So oblique forms that have the oblique base and then add the oblique suffix, or genitive forms that take the genitive base and add the genitive suffix. These are especially prevalent in Jaffna, so there is something going on there as well. And for example, the selection of oblique bases by the genitive suffix su, resulting in something like pami se, only happens in Jaffna. So some innovations there in comparison with what we find in the other areas. So that's something interesting about the Jaffna variety, and the Jaffna variety is now being researched with some intensity by Patricia. So we expect to be able to say more about the Jaffna variety in the future. All right, and just to close it off, because I think I've spoken too much, yes. This is where you can find information about the project and the collection itself. So if you want to access all our recordings and transcriptions and all of the material, you can do so on the ILAR archive at ilararchive.org and search for documentation of Sri Lanka Portuguese, or you have a direct handle there as well. And if you want to stay in touch with the research and any updates to the collection, you can Facebook our page, which you can find there on the right. All right, and with this I will end. Thank you very much for your attention, or as they say in Sri Lanka Portuguese, muito grande merci.
I will also say muito grande merci to Hugo and Patricia for that wonderful presentation. It's always good to hear about the documentation project. And as you say, it's a gift that keeps giving, and because you've gone into new readings and new analyses, and especially the really exciting things about the variation, syntactic variation you found. And all the best, Patricia, for your continued study of the Jaffna variety of Portuguese, of Sri Lanka Portuguese. Right, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions coming your way at the discussion session. So finally, our last presenter for this presentation is by Dr. Mahesh Radhakrishnan. He is joining us all the way from Sydney, specifically the Wangal County near Homebush Bay in Sydney. Dr. Radhakrishnan holds a PhD in linguistics from the Macquarie University. He's an anthropological linguist and an ethnomusicologist with research interests in many aspects of language, music, culture, and performance. They are currently an honorary associate at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music and also a collaborator at the Centre of Linguistics at the University of Lisbon. They are also research affiliate at the Centre for Excellence of the Dynamics of the Australian Research Council. Mahesh's most recent research has been on Cafrinha music of the Portuguese burghers. They also have researched traditional Irish Shano music, and South Indian Carnatic music. Mahesh will talk to us about the religious dimension of Portuguese burgher music. Mahesh, over to you. Mahesh and Hugo, sorry, it's a joint presentation by both Mahesh and Hugo.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Dinali, and I'd like to thank you and Professor Shashikala Asela and the ICH organizers for having us, and also to Dominic Essler as well for his role in initiating these discussions. It's a pleasure to talk about religious legacies in Portuguese burgher music. And the research for this talk comes out of the DSLP project, as Hugo mentioned. And though I'm speaking from Sydney, my background behind me is actually of Batikaloa. And you can, for those from Batikaloa, familiar with Batikaloa, you can spot Kaladi Bridge just over there. So this paper begins from a position which argues for the transparency and value of music in revealing a culture's worldview, as affirmed by ethnomusicologist Kirsty Gillespie, as well as an understanding of both religious and musical experience as occupying what scholars Anna Reid and Nithibon refer to as a transcendent space, taking people out of the everyday temporality of the mundane. Both music and religion are spaces where expressions of identity intersect and cultural memory are preserved. Portuguese burgher performance, which centers largely around the performance of cafrinha and also lances, which are secular dance forms, seems to have always also included its share of overtly religious repertoire, largely prayers and hymns within Catholic and Protestant traditions, as well as the incorporation of religious material within these secular traditions as well. And you'll have to excuse my cat, Meow Meow, will sometimes make an appearance. So our talk today will center on this repertoire as well as the presence of religious themes in cafrinha, both in the past and the present. Now hand it over to Ugo to talk about the early 19th century sources.
Right. So just by way of background, I'd say, and I won't spend too much time on this because we want to show you the recent materials. But if you look at the archival sources from the early 19th century, you do find this intersection of religious themes and music in different ways. It's quite well represented, but in different ways. And one of the typologies that you find in these documents is that of overtly religious song. So even though during the Dutch period, we don't have a lot of information of to what extent Sri Lanka Portuguese or Ceylon Portuguese was incorporated into religious services, specifically Protestant religious services. When it comes to the British period, it's rich with materials like this. And these are materials produced by mostly by missionaries. The Wesleyan Missionary Society was especially active in Ceylon at the time, and they did a lot of translations. So a lot of the materials that you find in the archives in the 19th century are liturgical works, which include song. So you have hymn books, for example, which are either translations or new productions of the missionaries, or translations of well-established liturgical works, such as the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. And here and there, you find hymns or you find texts which are meant to be sung. One example is given here on the screen, just to show you what it looks like. This is from a prayer book, but this prayer book actually opens with a song. And so if you look at the page on the right, this is the first page of the book, and it says a song to sing at the start of the divine service. This is written in Ceylon Portuguese. This is that's what has brought this into our sphere, the sphere of our project. And if you look at the translation, you will see that this is a very regular song that you would expect from that particular tradition. Come praise God, sing and adore, give eternal honor to the King of the world and heavens. So this is something to be sung at the start of the divine service, and you have plenty of examples like this in the archive. Now, if we move on to the next slide, there is a very peculiar example here, which is different, a little different from this tradition of the Wesleyan Missionary Society. It's not related to it, but it may give us some information, not about the Anglican Church, but about the Dutch Reformed Church and to what extent Portuguese or Sri Lanka Portuguese may have been integrated into the services. This is the Gaul Carol, which is very familiar to some of you attending, and I'm thinking specifically of Harin, who is attending this talk and has produced a beautiful arrangement of this particular carol. And this is a very interesting case. So the Gaul Carol is transcribed, as you can see, including music and words, transcribed in the Journal of the Dutch Burger Union. And in it, so it is transcribed and it is described by Percy Colin Tome. And he says, even though this was published in the late 20th century, he says that he recollects this particular carol being sung in the Dutch Reformed Church of Gaul in the 1920s during his childhood. And it is a very regular, I would say, Christmas carol. If you look at the text, it talks about the birth of Christ, so that's what you expect in a carol, but it has the added interest of coming from a Dutch Protestant, a Dutch Reformed Church tradition, but also It's one of those rare instances in which we don't have, in addition to the lyrics, we also have the music. Now, if we, a different set of data from the 19th century is not the specifically religious literature, but collections of, let's say, secular songs, song traditions of the burghers. And the most relevant source here is the Neville manuscript, which was collected for Hugh Neville, who was a British civil servant who served in Ceylon in the second half of the 19th century. This is a long collection of lyrics, and this has been extensively studied by Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya and by David Jackson. So it's a very well-known source. And what's interesting about the Neville manuscript is that the tone of the songs is decidedly secular, so it's different from what the missionaries produced. And the only religious references that you find here and there are basically formulaic references to God, or to God's punishment, or to a saint, right? So going through that document, what we find is a single quatrain, which is the first one you have here, which could be said to be mostly religious in tone, right? So here in this quatrain, we can hear Father of the Cross, ask Saint Anne where our Jesus died. So there's a decidedly religious theme, but most often what you find is what you have in the second part of this slide, which is a song about something else, typically love, and then in the middle of it there is a formulaic reference to God, like for example when with the verse Deus vence a lumara, which means God has blessed the moon, and it comes in the middle of a love song. Another source that we have that functions very much like this is also quite interesting, and it comes not from the Neville manuscript, but from another source. So this is an interesting case of a song which is found, this is a quatrain, a stanza found in a long song that was sent to Ugo Schuchart in 1894 by John Henry Eaton, who was a Ceylonese civil servant who was very familiar with Ceylon Portuguese, and this long song had been written down for him by someone whom we don't know, so an undisclosed local person. And then Schuchart, having received this song, includes it in his in a draft of a study on Ceylon Portuguese, which he never published, but Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya did edit and publish in 1999. So now we have access to this song, and again here what you have is a love song, and at some point there is a reference to, as you can see there, castigo de Deus, that means God's punishment. So this is the kind of integration of religious themes into non-religious songs that you find in secular songs of the burgher community.
Also in the late 19th century, you have C.M. Fernando's 1895 article, The Music of the Mechanics. This gives a great background about Cafrinha, including its performance context. And it talks about christenings, weddings, and anniversaries, and specifically mentions Catholicism as the community faith. And Fernando's article is interesting because it is apart from the one score that actually appears in the Schuchart's correspondences, it's the first known sets of notations of Portuguese burgher music, which is, in a context where there was mostly textual work. This is a rare find. In this collection, largely of Cafrinha tunes, is also two scores of what the author describes as chants. The Pater Noster, so Our Father in Portuguese, and the Ave Maria, Hail Mary. Fernando mentions the presence of Goan priests in Sri Lanka following the Portuguese period, including the development of a chant style known as Goanese chant, which could be a reference to a form related to the local chanting style that is present today in Sinhala and Tamil, known as Pasan. The nature and the relationship between Pasan and the Goanese chanting of the 19th century, though, and its development warrants further investigation. The religious material in the work of Ugo Schuchart also included a temperance song composed by his correspondent, Mr. Eaton, that Ugo mentioned earlier, set to a Kafrinya tune. So that's an interesting case of the religious entering the secular again. Now, going to the documentary of Sri Lanka Portuguese material, so there were a number of sessions in which religious themes did come out, and it was one of the topics amongst many others which were covered within the interviews. Now, these typically took the form of topics, but also included some prayers and discussions of religious festivals and a tour of church by community member Father Jude Johnson. There were two community members who discussed and recited prayers. One was Mr. Anton Ragul and briefly Mr. Luti Outskon. Mr. Ragul's prodigious input provides a clear demonstration of the power of music as a vehicle for religious expression. And his performance specifically of the Way of the Cross is a saga of dynamism and effort, lasting for around an hour and combining a range of registers of chant, song, and performed speech, combining European Portuguese and Sri Lanka Portuguese. Mr. Ragul performed this for the team in his sitting room. And so we'll now show an example of the Way of Cross performed by Mr. Ragul. Before I do, I just want to go through the sets of registers that Mr. Ragul uses. So you have impromptu speech, which is basically it's a kind of formal sort of speech that he uses at the beginning, and there's song with a set melody, which are mostly songs that are set to Sinhala and Tamil Catholic hymns. Then you have spoken chant, then you have spoken prayer, then you have sung chant in a very specific register, and then you have slow sung melody narrating the event. And this would be familiar to people that are from other South Asian Catholic traditions as well.
Nós kun sapoi Deus kaurau justu paya kawapa. Amor Deus
The register is just up there.
Nos pa amor paya pavi. Nos coitado ya fica. Nos sayam pa liberdade. Nos pa amata. Perdoatam, nos perdoatam. Pilo de sinal Santa Cruz livrai no Deus, dos nossos Senhor, dos nossos inimigos. Amém. Em nome do Pai, do Filho e do Espírito Santo. Amém. Ó Senhor, quanto sentem outros amor dela. Deus amonte unidade la fica. Amém. Paz fica nimitaia ficana. Senhor, paz nimitana. Noite faia pecado vida. Bos passes per ficaya nimitana.
And as I mentioned, particularly the last register, you hear echoes of that in a number of Way of Cross rituals across South Asia.
Nós kun sapoi Deus.
Excuse me. So I'm not sure how much time there is left, but I want to show a couple more examples. So this one is interesting because it is an example of Sinhala music and the influence on the tune. I'll just very briefly show, and this is an example of Amor de Versin Minor, and it's a tune version based on the Sinhala hymn Namo Mariane, which is also the same meaning. It's a song to Mother Mary as well.
Evara Singla Kantied Kanta. Namo Mariane, Namo Mariane, Namo Mariane, Prasad Puryavantini, Namo Mariane.
Amor deve ser mine. Amor deve ser mine. Nossos coitados ia ficar na. Amor deve ser mine.
So you have a very interesting example there of the influence of Sinhala church traditions on the Catholic traditions of the Portuguese burghers, particularly on Anton's Ragal's repertoire. And that's a very, very interesting phenomena to see taking place, especially considering the musical influences on Sinhala church music and its possible connection to Saralagi and other forms of South Asian music. Now I'll just quickly turn to an example of religious themes in non-religious music. And interestingly, this occurs in Kafrinya or Shikoti songs. Of these, the most striking exponent was the late Raymond Johnson, also from Trincomalee, who composed a number of Kafrinya lyrics within the framework largely known as straight baila. This clip features verses composed by the late Raymond Johnson and sung by his great nephew, Aubrey Paul, accompanied by his brother Gavin. And this was recorded during the project as well. And it highlights the way that religious themes may be present in the secular music of Kafrinya.
Roga para Deus, dá-me Deus Maria, pois para nós que grande alegria. Ontem está num dia, na irmã noite está num dia. Ontem não tinha na irmã disse alegria. Ontem não tinha na irmã disse alegria. Ontem está num dia, na irmã noite está num dia.
So anyone familiar with baila music will hear strains of familiar motifs in that music, and that is very characteristic of straight baila within the Portuguese burgher Kafrinya tradition. Other examples, here you can see some examples which are recorded as were recorded today. As you'll note, there's religious appearances that appear in the service of other themes, mainly love. The first is from the verses within the canon of verses used for Kafrinya. The second, more cheeky one, is from a composition, but also within the Kafrinya repertoire. So in the case of Portuguese burgher music and dance, much of what is encountered is largely secular in context, function, and theme. So for example, in Kafrinya, which largely centers around love, gender relations, marriage, money, and other everyday themes, often to humorous effect. Nevertheless, as shown above in this example of, it's from a wedding. So the wedding took place in the church, as you can see, and then following the church wedding, there's a reception in which the Kafrinya takes place. So even within Kafrinya, the influence of religious expression is never far away. So it's frequently performed at celebrations typically tied to Catholic religious ceremonies, for example, marriages and first communions. The transcendent quality of both religion and music here provide a worthwhile field for understanding Portuguese burgher identity. And the examples discussed today sort of demonstrate the endurance of religious expression in music in the past and the present, as well as the rich scope for further scholarly inquiry. Muito grande merce, istuti, nandri, and obrigado.
Stuti, Nandri, obrigado, muito grande merci, Mahesh. So nice to hear your latest work on the music, yours and Hugo's collaboration as well. You took us from the secular to the religious and back again to the secular and the baila. And I'm sure at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you had some of our toes tapping here. So thank you very much. So I'm not going to rabbit on any longer. I think it's time to open up the discussion to everyone who's been attending. We have over 30 people here, and I already have a question from Marlan Arias Singh. Thanks, Marlan. Hi. For Hugo and the team, thank you for that important work you are all doing. I came across your research a while back and was immediately fascinated because in my linguistics lectures, both BA and MA, we hardly learned about South Asian varieties. A question to Hugo and Patricia. What are some of the connections between Sri Lanka Portuguese and Portuguese Creoles in the region, such as in Diu, Malabar, and Corley?
Malabar, correct.
All right. Thank you very much for that question. This is still something that we're working on, trying to find the connections, but they are very clear between Sri Lanka Portuguese and the Creoles of the Malabar, which is probably expected because they share, I mean, at least in more recent times, they share a Dravidian substrate that may explain some of the similarities. One of the striking things is that Sri Lanka Portuguese its first claim to fame, let's say, when the first modern descriptions started coming out, was that unlike the other Creoles that were known at the moment, it was SOV, which means that the basic word order placed the subject first, then the object, and then the verb at the end of the clause, right? It turns out that in the Malabar, it's the same way. So it's not just Sri Lanka, it's also it's this cluster from South India and Sri Lanka that behaves like that. But even when you compare Sri Lanka Portuguese with the other Creoles of India from northern or central India, for example, that don't behave this way, don't have a verb final syntax, you find lots of similarities, for example, in the forms of function words, right? So for example, in the Creole of Corley, the element that you use for the genitive is also the su, right? So it's what you find in Sri Lanka, it's what you also find in some of the Creoles of India, but even beyond that, that's also the genitive particle all the way in Malacca in Malaysia and in Macau in China, which means that there was some circulation of materials which can only be explained by the networks of connection between the places where the Portuguese were. So there is a lot to unpack when it comes to comparing the Creoles, the Portuguese-based Creoles of Asia. And it's, as I was trying to say, it's abundantly clear that the closest relative, let's say, to Sri Lanka Portuguese is the Malabar Creoles of southwestern India, right? But all that they are affiliated in a larger family, which we could call the Indo-Portuguese Creole. So South Asia as a whole also shares a number of features. But even if we look beyond South Asia, you will find similarities. Less so, but you will find some similarities.
Thank you, Hugo. Any other questions? Any questions from? Okay, Marlon says, thank you for the comprehensive response.
Hi, I have a question, if you may permit me, please.
Yes, of course, go ahead. Just identify yourself, introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ruan Disroisa. I'm from UK at the moment. So my question is for Christian Mendes, actually. It's two-part question. The first one is, in one of your earlier slides, you mentioned Portuguese came to Ceylon in 1506. Now, is that a mistake, or are you contributing to Donald Ferguson's view that Portuguese actually came in 1506 rather than 1505? So that's the first question. The second question to you is, you mentioned that some of the Portuguese bastions were demolished entirely and rebuilt. Now, from a perspective of building, wouldn't that be more expensive than to build another bastion entirely in a different area or just adjacent, rather than demolishing the whole thing and rebuilding it again? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your two questions. So for the first question, actually, yes, I'm using Donald Ferguson's dating of the Portuguese arrival. That is also corroborated by Professor Chandra de Silva. So I believe, although those two researchers have used that dating, unfortunately, everyone sort of just goes with the general understanding that the Portuguese came in 1505. So it's a bit hard sometimes to change the general perception of things. But I read the researchers of these two, of Donald Ferguson and Professor Chandra de Silva, and so their arguments are pretty strong for 1506. So that's why I tended to go with 1506. For your second question, yes, as you say, completely demolishing a bastion or a fort and rebuilding is pretty costly. So that's what I actually wanted to sort of prove with my presentation, that weren't the case. So that's generally thought to be the case. But as some of the examples I showed, that weren't the case. Wherever possible, they tended to use the Portuguese walls and bastions, either slightly modifying it or sort of incorporating it as a core into their walls. So that's what my conclusion was, that like you can't sort of generalize on the fate of the Portuguese fort. It depends on each site, but most often they reused it in various ways than a complete demolition. I hope that would have answered your question.
Just a supplementary question on that. So do you think that the Portuguese have decided their geographical location in a very, very strategic position so that the Dutch will find a better place? Is that the reason why they demolished something and rebuilt it in the same place?
Possibly. I actually have not investigated deeply into sort of the functional and strategic locations of the Portuguese, but if you look at where the Dutch fort sites are, most of them are at strategic locations. So since many of them originate from Portuguese point, it can be assumed that yes, the Portuguese also were strategic in their selection of fortress sites.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you very much for the questions. Anything else? Any other questions? Somebody has asked whether the discussion is taped. Yes, it is. I think it's streaming live on Facebook, where it will be hosted with the ICH Facebook page. Since I have a couple of friends who are participating, I'm going to invite them. One is Dr. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya. Would you like to respond? Would you like to comment if you're here? Dr. Jayasuriya, are you here? Sorry to put you in the spot, but I'm sure you'll have something interesting to say. No, maybe she slept. Just to get the ball rolling again, I have a question for Dominic. You ended by talking about the future. Dominic, are you there? Have we lost Dominic?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, Dominic. You ended your presentation by talking about the future, what we can learn by we can learn by looking at your documents about the future. Would you like to elaborate?
Okay, this is why I said about the caste issues. Is this what you had in mind?
Well, anything you like.
Yeah. Okay. I think this set of the documents, which are very easy to read, they're in the Vito Perniola's books, and usually you can find them in Vijiti Yapa or Lake House, or lots of bookshops in Colombo, maybe Barefoot. So if anyone wants to go and grab the third volume of the Portuguese period, they can do so, and it's kind of they're towards the end of the book. So I think the question of whether these complaints accurately represented exactly what was going on is kind of that's one issue. But for me, what's really interesting about them is the insights that they give into, as I've said, this kind of everyday life in Jaffna, and they just have so much information. And I haven't really gone into that kind of thing in my presentation, but there's lots of things about everyday kind of agriculture. There's all kinds of things about caste relationships. There are these little mentions of other kinds of relationships, as I said, the kind of marriage practices and the way that that was kind of rubbing up against kind of priest disapproval of cross-cousin marriage. So for me, what I would like to do is kind of get more into all of this detail and see what it says about the context of this kind of the height of the Portuguese period, the 1640s. So I think that's what I'd like to do in the future. I'd like to kind of dig more into those things which aren't necessarily part of whether the complaints are accurate, and look at all of that kind of the everyday kind of social history of people's life in Jaffna. And in that sense, I think that they're so valuable. You have this kind of amazing insight into all of these totally everyday things which you just don't see anywhere else, and they come out in this kind of unusual set of complaints about kind of other matters in a way. So that, I think, talking about the future, that's what I would like to do with them.
Okay, great. Any other questions to Dominic?
Dinali?
Hi, Jock.
I've got two sort of rather naive questions for the linguists. First of all, why did Portuguese hang on in Tamil-speaking areas but not Sinhala-speaking areas? So I'm thinking, for instance, of Vacote and Galgaboa, which are both supposedly Portuguese refugee communities, both Catholic, but as far as I know, there's no real records of Portuguese being spoken there. And the second question, which in a way is linked to the first, is why did Portuguese hang on and Dutch didn't? That's it, naive questions.
All right. Thank you very much for those two questions. If I may try to answer, and perhaps Patricia wants to add anything. Well, those two questions are not as easily responded. So I think I do have a good idea of how to respond to the second one, but not necessarily to the first one. So let's start with that. Why did Portuguese hang on rather than Dutch? If you read some of the descriptions of family life and public life produced by the Dutch burger community, you realize something interesting, which is that when during the Dutch period, the Portuguese language was, well, even though they tried to ban it, they did ban it from public life. So things like church and administration would be in Dutch, but the Portuguese language, or Ceylon Portuguese, was used in the household, and the received knowledge is that happened because there was intermarriage with people who already spoke this language, or the people who spoke that language worked in the households. So what seems to have happened was that Portuguese prevailed in the household, but not outside, and that's what made it possible for it to last even after Dutch was replaced with English in the public sphere. So that's my impression of what could explain that situation. Now, when it comes to why did Portuguese hang on in the Tamil-speaking areas, that's not very easy to answer, and it's a very, very good question. I suspect it has something to do with the nature of the communities and the structure of the communities in the different areas. So going back to what I just said, there was a period in which Ceylon Portuguese was also a language of the so-called Dutch burghers, right? And eventually the Dutch burghers gave it up in favor of English, but the so-called Portuguese burghers did not. So I suspect that in these areas, there may have been a larger concentration of population that identified as Portuguese burgher. That's probably it. But I haven't done any research into that specifically. That's where I would start. I would start by looking at how the burgher community differed in different parts of Ceylon and then Sri Lanka, and that's probably the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Any other questions? No more questions?
I got another question, if I may.
Okay, right.
Right. So this question is directed to Mahesh in particular, but I would like to have the opinions of other experts as well on this issue. Few years ago, I was traveling in Cyprus and went to a church just to have a look inside and realized that the fourth Sunday service is sung in Sinhalese. And then I realized that in that particular area, there is a significant Sri Lankan community, especially from Negombo, and they have kept their tradition by importing a Sinhalese priest, and they have the mass sung in Sinhalese on the fourth Sunday. So my idea is there sufficient interest and sufficient number of Portuguese Creole speaking people anywhere, particularly I'm thinking in terms of Batiklo, and could somebody fund at least one service per month in the Portuguese Creole so that the traditions and the songs could be perpetuated rather than letting it die?
I'll start off, and Ugo, if you have anything to add, please come in. That's a very fascinating question, and I think it links into so many questions of language and cultural maintenance. I think with any of these things, it's definitely a matter for the community to, if there's an aspiration for these kind of things to happen. And we already see that in the presence of prayers in Sri Lanka Portuguese as practiced by Anton Ragel, and the Way of the Cross ceremony, within Sri Lanka Portuguese. So these kind of things are happening. I guess if the community was interested in looking at that, then there might be scope for people to look at funding that. But yeah, so I don't know, Ugo, did you want to add anything, or maybe the community members who are here might want to say something?
I think I can add something very quick to what Mahesh said, which is exactly right. So it's a matter for the community to decide, and it's also true that there are a few priests who are members of the community and fluent in Sri Lanka Portuguese, right? So if this was possible, if this was practical, if this becomes practical, it can be done. In fact, we have a couple of interviews with a priest in our collection who is absolutely fluent, but I don't think he ever preached in Sri Lanka Portuguese, though he can, right? So it is a matter for the community. The preservation of prayers, as Mahesh was saying, the preservation of prayers in Portuguese in certain moments, such as, for example, funerals, is a struggle. So there's only a couple of people who know how to do it, and they are in high demand. So sometimes they will have time to go and and perform those prayers at a particular time. Sometimes they do not. So it is a struggle. It is possible. And in fact, some of the conversations I had with people in the community were that, you know, if you're ever interested in investing in that, in, for example, translating certain liturgical texts into modern Sri Lanka Portuguese, perhaps we can help. It would be a nice way, I would say, of keeping the language alive in further domains than the ones that it has now. Yeah.
Just to add, thank you for that answers. I know that related to Expo 98, which happened in Lisbon, I think, there was the Portuguese government actually produced a couple of CDs which contain Sri Lankan Batiklo singers singing Portuguese songs as well. So I'm just thinking in terms of at least some project like that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. We have a few more on the chat box. One from Harin Amirthanathan. Hi, Harin. My question is for Dominic. You mentioned titles such as Kanakapille, Talaya, Adigar. I couldn't quite get the, pardon me, I couldn't quite get the first two names you mentioned. I did hear a reference to a magistrate and a bell ringer. If you could mention these again, these names again, please. Also, the Mupu and the Annavir is also common titles used within the church. So he has a question and a comment to Dominic.
Right, okay, yes, thanks. So Mupu and Annavir, I think those came in later. I feel like those are perhaps terms that started to be used during the Portuguese period when the Oratorians were working in Sri Lanka. It's a good question. I'm familiar with those terms, of course, but I haven't seen them in the earlier documents. And in the letters from the inquiry, they very clearly say that it's the Merinyu and the Kanakapille who are the agents. So Merinyu is, that's the Portuguese word, which in this context refers to these were the kind of enforcers for the state or for the church. So they were individuals who would, in the church's case, they would ring the bell, but they would make sure people were coming to mass. And for the state, they would be doing things like making sure that people were turning up for their obligatory caste service. And you see this in the Dutch period as well, by which time they're called Merinji, it seems. So they were doing the same things. They were kind of making sure people turned up for their compulsory labor and making sure people came to church. Although, of course, this was for this is not for the Catholic Church by that point. Yes, so, but specifically Mupus and Annavir. So Mupu would be, for people who don't know, the Mupu would be the head of the church, be the kind of the villager who was the church head, which is a position which doesn't exist anymore, as the priest is now the head of the church, but the Mupu would have been the head of the church. Now, I don't think they appear that early, but it's something I would have to check. Was it specifically about those two? Oh yes, Kanakapille. So Kanakapille, as I said, that's the Tamil term for a kind of accountant. So yeah, so those are the two agents that are mentioned. Was it specifically about those you're interested in, or did you want me to talk about the other terms as well that I mentioned, the official positions?
Karin, go ahead. Karin, would you like to add? Or are you chatting on the box? No. Okay, I don't think there's a follow-up question.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you for answering my question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank
yes,
you.
Yeah, I'm going to have a look at that question about the Mupu. I think it might be that the way in which the Portuguese were running the church at that point didn't have that local, the kind of structure that happened later on, where you would have a kind of church committee from the villages. And it looks to me like it was actually much more top down. So the priest was in charge, and then he had his Marinos and his Kanakapilles, but they didn't have, as you had later on, a Mupu and perhaps a secretary and a treasurer and all these kind of things that you would have today as well, apart from the Mupu, as I said. But you'd have that local committee, so perhaps it just wasn't as established at that time as it was later on.
Yeah, thank you for answering my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic, and thanks, Harin. There is
Sorry, Dinali, you've cut out.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Thank you so much. Bit cack-handed here. There is a response to Roy de Soisa's question about why there isn't Portuguese services in the particular churches anymore, from Earl, who's a speaker of Portuguese, Sri Lanka Portuguese. He said there is Mass in Sri Lanka Portuguese. We have discussed this at community level and with Portuguese priests. Sri Lanka Portuguese is not an approved language by the church, but Portuguese is, and sermons can be said in Sri Lanka Portuguese. Thanks a lot, Earl. Thanks a lot for joining as well. We'll move on to the next question from Asita. I have a question about the tradition, especially the styles of music sung by the Portuguese speakers. I wonder whether the same kind of music is or was popular in other places where the Portuguese colonized, especially in India. This one's also for you, Mahesh, I think.
Thanks very much for this question. It's a big question, and it's a simple answer is yes, in terms of similarity and relationship and connection. As with the language, there's a network of circulations of cultural influence across the Indian Ocean wherever the Portuguese have been, and even before Portuguese colonization, you know, there were networks of connection between these places. But what happened from the Portuguese time onwards is that there was a real establishment of these networks, and particularly literal societies. And you see this in the music, and particularly with the west coast of India, but also going far up to Malacca in Malaysia, and you have tunes that you've found in, like, you know, 19th century Sri Lanka that now still sung in Macau. So you have this connection, but specifically with west coast of India and Sri Lanka, there's definitely strong connections there. And Professor De Silva Jayasuriya, sorry, Shan, has commented on this and done research on it as well. And yeah, this is something that is definitely ripe for exploration. Ugo, did you want to add anything to that? Because you've looked at oral traditions, and yeah. Sorry.
Well, just briefly, what I did earlier, and not just me, was look not at music and music styles, but at lyrics. And there's also a circulation of lyrics that you find in the places that Mahesh mentioned. So all the way from Diu in northwestern India to East Timor and Java Island on Indonesia. There's a circulation of themes and verses, which probably points at or suggests that there was also the circulation of music and tunes that Mahesh was talking about. And yes, there's a lot of research to be done in that area.
Thanks, Hugo, and thank you for that question as well. There is a ontological question here from Piero. Dear participants, I would like to have your opinion on this. The Kafir, the African community of Putlam, or the Kafirs of Putlam and China Bay, who are descendants of the slaves brought to Sri Lanka in the Portuguese era. This is real madness. Hence also the much publicized music that descends from the African Kafir of the Portuguese era is a big lie. But I would like to see the evidence to support this lie on the Kafir. Incredible, from Piero. Would anybody like to have a go at this question? I think the gist of it is that there is nothing called a Kafir.
I'm not sure I understood the question, actually.
Okay. Piero, would you like to pose your question?
This is Boru. Mandana prasnek nene. Mama okomotienova. But what to do? I don't know what people tell these communities are from Portuguese era. that is very bigly. Not impossible. I have any record you like to see. No problem for me.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, it has to do with the actual.
Yeah, I am Italian. Talking English very fast, I have trouble.
Sure.
You talk in Portuguese. I know Portuguese very well.
Right. So this is about the ultimate origin of the Kafir community, right? When they were formed and all that. Yes. What you find in the literature, and none of us here. I mean, none of us in the documentation project are historians.
Yes, but I have.
Yeah.
No worry.
What you find in the literature is sometimes contradictory. So there are different possibilities, whether it's from the Portuguese period, from the Dutch period, from the British period. As a non-historian, I personally am not going to get involved. This is something for historians to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you, Hugo. I think there's a response from Roy again.
Very sorry, but in any place in Sri Lanka is writing, the music is coming from Kafir area. Anytime is writing, the Kafir is Bantu. And also the Portuguese only station for the slave is Elmina in Ghana. In Ghana, no Bantu people. That is incredible, Gato. And this is a very big lead. I don't know what places come this also in the any places writing the music is Kafrinya music. Kafrinya music in Sri Lanka is only from 19th century, 20th century, sorry, not more.
Okay, thank you very much, Piero. There is a response from Roy on the chat. I think I can welcome you to read it, but unfortunately we've run out of time and I'm getting messages from the organizers to wrap up. So there is apparently some evidence.
Maybe, sorry, lady, somebody have a document about.
Okay, I think we can have this discussion at another time and another day, because I think this session needs to close up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
thank you. On behalf of the International Conference on the Humanities 2020-2021, I would like to thank our panelists on this session: Christian Mendes, Dr. Dominic Essler, Dr. Hugo Cardoso, Patricia Costa, and Dr. Mahesh Radhakrishnan, Mahesh White Radhakrishnan. I'm sorry, Mahesh, I got your name wrong all this time. Thank you very much for joining us from so many different corners of the country at really strange hours for some of you to take part in this panel discussion. And I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation where we can have more fora like this, where it's always, despite the horrible strictures that have been imposed on us because of the pandemic, we could meet again and talk about this stuff. And I would like to end on this note that let's look at this as a continuing conversation, a continuing dialogue on this imprint of Portuguese in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the participants who asked such interesting questions, and thank you for your patience because I have gone over a little over time. So on that note, let me finish and have a pleasant afternoon, have a pleasant rest of the conference, and goodbye, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too, everyone.
Thank you, Denali. See you, everyone.
Bye.